Hi, I'm Micah Woods, Chief Scientist at the Asian Turfgrass Center. This is a story about MLSN, the minimum levels for sustainable nutrition. These are nutrient guidelines that are used for interpreting soil test results for turfgrass. Based on the interpretation and the resultant fertilizer recommendations, one can ensure that the turf is supplied with all the nutrients it can use, while at the same time avoiding unnecessary fertilizer applications. In this video, we'll hear what the MLSN guidelines are, how they work, and how they were developed. We will also hear from turfgrass managers who have used the MLSN guidelines to hear about the results that they've seen and some of the challenges that they've faced as they implemented this method of fertilizer application based on soil testing. The MLSN guidelines were a joint project developed by ATC, my company, and Pace Turf, the company of Larry Stowell and Wendy Galernter in San Diego, California. We developed the guidelines because we realized that conventional nutrient guidelines for turfgrass were broken. And what I mean by broken is that the conventional guidelines, if you interpret your soil test that way, you'll always think that you have a problem with your soil. You'll always get a report back saying there's some problem here, there's not enough of this element, you need more potassium, you need more calcium. And people were making all kinds of fertilizer applications that weren't actually necessary to produce the desired turfgrass surfaces. Once we realized this, we stumbled across or came across the idea to develop new nutrient guidelines, which we called MLSN, and these guidelines are based on good performing turf, the type of soils in which good performing turf is growing all over the world. I'm going to explain now how these guidelines are used, so let's go ahead and get started. I wish I could have shot that entire episode out at the beach, but I thought that I could explain this a little bit better by coming into the office. MLSN stands for Minimum Levels for Sustainable Nutrition. It's an initialism for that phrase. And to put this into context, I want to talk a little bit about what turfgrass management is, and then I'll explain how I think MLSN fits into that. One way that we can define turfgrass management, and that I often define turfgrass management as, it's modifying the growing environment of the grass to create the desired surface. Another way that I've explained turfgrass management more recently is as modifying the growth rate of the grass to create the desired surface. So with either one of those definitions, we can find how MLSN fits into that. At the very broad picture, this is what we're trying to do, and narrowing it down a little bit at the next level of detail, if we're modifying the growing environment, I often discuss modifying the growing environment in these 6 ways. Modifying the light, the air, the water, the fertilizer, that's where MLSN comes in, doing pest control, and focusing especially on mowing, which has a tremendous impact on creating the desired surface. So if we're modifying the growing environment, MLSN fits in as one of those categories. If we're doing the growth rate definition, in that case, the growth rate is affected by light, temperature, the plant water status, and the leaf nitrogen content. And that's where MLSN fits in, even though nitrogen is not explicitly part of MLSN. But the leaf nitrogen content affecting the growth rate makes the assumption that other nutrients are not limiting. And that's where MLSN fits in, because MLSN, when applied, will ensure that all the nutrients are supplied in adequate amounts to the grass. So when we get down to another level of detail and focus not on creating a turfgrass surface, but just on the fertilizer or just on the nutrient management aspect of either one of those definitions of turfgrass management, we want to ask 2 questions. We want to know, is this element required as fertilizer? And if it is required as fertilizer, how much of it should be applied? And to create the desired turfgrass conditions, this is creeping bentgrass at PGA Catalunya. To create the surface we want, at this location, we need to answer both of those questions. We need to be able to answer, is this element, for all the elements, we need to say, is this element required as fertilizer? And if the answer to that is yes, we need to know how much to apply. And it would be nice to have a system that would work everywhere for all kinds of grass. So if we went to Portugal, this is in the Algarve, and here are 3 different kinds of grass. There is agrostis on the tees, tall fescue in the rough, and cynodon on the fairways. So now we have a different climate, we have different soils, we have different grass types. How can we also answer those same questions? We want to answer, is this element required as fertilizer? And if it is required, how much do we need to apply? Or we can go to Iceland. This is Festuca at Greenkeeping Golf Club, and we're trying to answer those same questions. What method can we use to answer the question of, is the element required as fertilizer and how much should we apply? I think there's 3 ways to answer those questions. One could just guess. One could make fertilizer applications, one could make nutrient applications by guessing how much to apply. One could also apply exactly what the grass could use, or could apply more than that and just completely disregard the soil. This actually is what's done with the STURF precision fertilization approach. And that works very good because that is disregarding the soil and just supplying 100% of what the grass can use. However, I think there's an even better way to do it, and that is considering what's in the soil. So one could also apply based on soil testing. If we look at these 3 different approaches, you might think somebody could guess pretty good. Maybe some people are better at guessing than others. But I don't recommend guessing or disregarding the soil. And Wayne Cousseau wrote an article that had a very good quote about this. He said, applying nutrients to turf grass growing on soil already well supplied with the nutrients is a waste of time and money. And I think that it's important to consider the soil, because if the soil is well supplied with the nutrients, we don't need to apply them as fertilizer. The grass can get those nutrients from the soil. So to minimize the waste of time and money, it makes sense to me to consider what is in the soil. So what if we do this based on soil testing? Here's some Poa annua at Ealing Golf Club in London, England. And if we would test this soil and use a conventional approach to soil test interpretation, how might that work? Would that enable us to answer those questions of, is this element required as fertilizer? And answer the question, how much do we need to apply? Well, there's a couple problems with soil testing. This is from a paper by Turner and Waddington in 1978. They said, well, they did a survey of different soil testing labs and recommendations, and they found that recommendations appear to be based on research done with other crops, such as forages, results from turfgrass fertility studies that were not designed to relate to soil testing, and guessing, the best judgment of the agronomist making the recommendations. I think we don't really want to guess. Even if we're good at guessing, that doesn't transfer very well to different grasses and different soils. It would be nice to base this on research that is designed to relate to soil testing, and to do it based on research done with turfgrass. So that was in 1978, and you might think that after those problems were identified, that there would be a flurry of research to fix these problems, because there's tons of research done in the 1980s, 1990s, continuing to this day. Well, this is from this book. Here's a quote from Turfgrass Soil Fertility and Chemical Problems by Drs. Carroll, Waddington, and Reiki. This book was published in 2001. And if we turn to page 164, there's a quote right there that I've put on this slide. It says, in some cases, turf grasses have been placed in a high P and K requirement category, while pasture grasses were in a low category. This decision was based on economics, not agronomics. The cost of fertilization was not considered of primary importance for turf. So that means that soil testing can give some problems if we're guessing, like Waddington identified, if the recommendations are based on other crops that aren't even turf grass, or if it's based on research that wasn't even designed to relate to soil testing. And here, from the textbook in 2001, they're saying it's not even based on agronomics, it's based on the assumption that fertilizer cost doesn't matter. That's not very good. And with more recent research, this is from Doug Soldat in an article he wrote in 2013, and he said that every time a researcher conducts one of these studies, they tend to find that the levels required are lower than what we previously thought, meaning that low potassium you got on your last soil test report might be optimum down the road. So as I was studying this and realizing that there's this big problem with the way we're answering two fundamental questions about something that's a key component of the very definition of turfgrass management, the nutrient supply or the fertilization of turfgrass, to answer the questions, how do we know if this element is required as fertilizer? And secondly, if it is required, how can we find out how much is applied? So working with Wendy Galernter and Larry Stowell, the scientists from Pace Turf, we did the project. We did a data analysis of thousands of soil test results to try to come up with a better way to answer those questions. And here I am with Wendy in beautiful San Diego, California. And here I am with Larry. In fact, you know what? I think I'm going to give Larry a call and see if we can talk about MLSN a little bit and find out more about the background of what we did. Hello, Larry. Good to talk with you.
Hi, Micah. It's nice to hear from you again.
We have known each other for a long time, or certainly I remember reading your stuff from about 20 years ago onwards, and then as I went to graduate school, we were in what seems to me like regular communication about various issues related to turfgrass nutrition and water quality, tissue testing, soil testing, and all of that. But we didn't develop the MLSN guidelines until what, 7 or 8 years ago. Do you remember how that all got started?
Yeah, I think it was pretty good. I think when I first started watching your work, I got pretty interested in the presentation you made at the Agronomy Society meetings, and it was on potassium and the low levels of potassium that you provided that produced great performing turf. And that got me to thinking that probably our guidelines were a little bit too high, and we've been using conventional sufficiency levels for available nutrient guidelines, and I blended in a little bit of base cation saturation ratio stuff. And from that point, I think you started my education on some of the concepts where we're not looking for just an ideal level, but we're just trying to figure out what the turf needs, and not so much just what levels that you can supply based on some other type of a model. And I think over the years, we just kept talking back and forth, and I pushed the base cation saturation ratios mainly because I was looking at sodium percentages in soil. And then once we separated that out as a salt management issue, that's not a turfgrass nutrition issue, then the discussions really focused in, I think, on what the plant needs, and then even more importantly, recently, the environmental impacts and costs of over applying fertilizers became into a very clear focus. So really, I think, got us working on, what is it exactly the plant needs? How do we determine how you would identify the plant needs? And then, and that's what as I recall, that's how we came up with the discussions. And then we started looking at all the data, because between us, we had tens of thousands of soil tests that we could mine to find out what the lowest levels that you could have in the soil that produced good quality turf.
And was there something about that conference that was happening in 2012 that prompted you to just say we need a project to work on, or we've been thinking about this, let's do an analysis to present something at this conference?
Well, I don't think the conference was the key. I think we came up with the idea first, and then this conference showed up at the right time, and it was kind of it's the Boyukas conference, and the nice thing with that is they publish proceedings, which made it kind of nice to be able to get the information out in a pretty thorough way, even though it's only in an abstract format. So I think we thought it was important enough to try to get it out as soon as we could.
And another thing that I remember when we were working on this, there was a lot of communication back and forth about what we were working with and how we were doing this, because it was kind of a new way of doing data analysis for me, and we spent a lot of time on this. But I remember distinctly that we weren't sure if anybody would ever really adopt these guidelines or use them. We were intending to use them for our own work, I think, but we really had no idea if anybody would use them. Have you been surprised at how widely these guidelines have been used and discussed?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it did shift the paradigm a little by looking at the data the way we looked at it. But I think once people started studying a little bit more carefully, that it became clear that it was a great system to use. And there's more university research that is being conducted just on nutrition calibration that seems to be backing up all the observations we've seen so far. So I don't know. I think it's surprising in one way that it's gotten out there, and then in another way, I think it was a pretty good promotion program to help get this out. So we felt it was pretty important that people could get their hands on the data. So we made all the information available as easily as possible. And then you speak at a lot of locations, so do I. And then Jason Haynes has been speaking places, and then we hear the universities have been helping out a lot and trying to promote the idea. And I think they're adopting the concept. And then I think there's no reason why this won't be improved. If some other methods or techniques become available, or some other way to look at the data, I'm sure it can be improved. But and we know that the polyar calcium data are a little higher than they need to be because of some of the biases and where some of the samples are coming from. So I think it's the MLSN is a good start. The concept is just providing what the plant needs is the biggest thing. I think calling it minimum levels for sustainable nutrition is doesn't matter what you really call it, but just as long as you're just providing what the plant needs and you have some way to identify that, that's going to be the key.
Yeah, I really agree with that. It's not even that it has to be with Malic 3 and it has to be these exact numbers, because if one has a set of data of soil test results from good performing turf, perhaps from a country that's using a completely different extraction method, it's the same principle, the same concepts can be applied to find a minimum level for that particular extractant and to then interpret the soil test results and make fertilizer recommendations to ensure that the grass is supplied with all that it can use using what would end up being a different extractant and a different number. But this principle, or this method of analyzing soil test results and then making fertilizer recommendations from those results seems to work extremely well for highly managed turf grass.
Yeah, I think it's great. Now, we need to stress that there is more to it than just simply looking at the low levels, because we did look at the distributions of the data and where people get tripped up now, and we see this where people are talking about 95% confidence intervals on some type of data. So there's some details in how the data is analyzed to be able to get a valid low number. That's not something we need to go into now, but there's some science behind the way this was worked out that are important to consider when someone's trying to get those low levels, figure out what they are.
To change the subject slightly, you and Wendy at Pace Turf, I know you've done a lot about integrated pest management, IPM, and precision turfgrass management, PTM, and best management practices, BMP. How does this fit in with that as far as nutrient management for turfgrass?
Yeah, well, I think that's the idea, that we were looking at kind of a general guideline that would be applicable to many locations. And I think the MLSN guidelines are ideal to plug right into an IPM program or BMPs to provide a solid method of making those fertilizer recommendations when you're looking at reducing inputs, having the smallest environmental footprint you can have. It's the way to go.
All right, Larry. Well, I've certainly enjoyed working with you on this project. I never realized that it would be this big of a deal, that people from all over the world would be making use of these guidelines and using it to such great success to get good turfgrass results, excellent turfgrass results, saving money, doing all kinds of great things with something that we helped develop. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you for pushing on moving the whole project forward, because it wouldn't have gone anywhere without your nudging. If anybody knows Micah, you'll know that he's able to nudge pretty annoyingly.
Annoyingly. All right. Well, persistent.
Persistent. All right. Well, thank you, Micah. It has been a pleasure working with you. It's wonderful.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Bye-bye. We made a lot of calculations to find the MLSN guidelines, and we did this by looking at soil test results from good performing turf all over the world. You can find these results. We've shared them in various places. We've made a lot of calculations, and this is a web app that shows that. We've written about it in various articles, including in Golf Course Management magazine, and we've written about it at a more technical level in PureJ preprints, and we've also shared the code that we use to make the calculations. There's a tremendous amount of background information that you can get about the details of all of these calculations, about the data that were used, and it should give you some reassurance that the MLSN guidelines will work well. We've also made some cheat sheets which give a step-by-step process to make the calculations to find out how much fertilizer to apply, and you can find all of that information online. You can find it by searching on Google or going to the asianturfgrass.com website. But I want to take a step back and just explain in very simple terms what MLSN is all about in the way that one calculates a fertilizer rate or a fertilizer application amount based on the MLSN guidelines. When we made these calculations, I knew that there was a lot of humbug involved in soil test interpretation and in fertilizer recommendations. And we made these calculations and developed the MLSN guidelines to come up with a method, to come up with a system that would ensure the grass is always supplied with all the nutrients that it can use, and at the same time that the fertilizer recommendations based on that method would avoid unnecessary nutrient applications and also avoid a lot of humbuggery. If we are going to make fertilizer applications and we're not doing any soil testing, then it makes complete sense to supply 100% of what the grass can use. Because if the grass is growing quickly, it's going to use a lot of nutrients. If the grass is growing slowly, it's going to use very few nutrients. For example, at a sports field such as this one in Barcelona, if the grass is growing very quickly, we can expect it to use a lot of nutrients. If we go to a fine fescue golf course, such as this links course in Fife in Scotland, we will expect the grass will grow a lot slower. The grass will use fewer nutrients. So we keep that principle in mind, that the rate of grass growth, which is dependent on the use of the turf at a particular site, it's dependent on the season, it's dependent on the grass species, it's dependent on the management style of the turfgrass manager, that is one component of how much nutrients are required, because if we don't do any soil testing, it makes sense to just supply what the grass uses. But if we do soil testing, we can then consider what can be supplied from the soil. So when there is a soil test, now it makes sense to supply the amount that the grass uses that it cannot get from the soil. So we would express that as the grass use minus the amount that's in the soil. The grass use minus the soil test. And we want to keep a little bit extra there. We want to keep enough in reserve to be confident that there won't be any deficiency. We never want the grass to run out of any nutrients. MLSN actually, based on the way we made the calculations and on the way that we do the fertilizer calculations for nutrient supply based on MLSN, the actual MLSN minimum number is an extra amount to keep in reserve. You can find these guidelines on the Pace Turf website, or as usual through Google. We specifically use this, well, this is one kind of equation to find the fertilizer amount. So we find the amount that's used by the grass, we can call that A. We take the MLSN minimum level, call that B. We look at the soil test result, that's C. If we take A plus B minus C, we get Q, which is the quantity of fertilizer to supply to the turf over a given amount of time based on the expected amount of nutrient used by the grass over that period of time. So there's some calculations involved, but there are tons of resources available to help you make that calculation. For example, the cheat sheets, various blogs, and tutorials. And I think it would make sense at this point, instead of me talking about it or showing any more equations, let's hear from some golf course superintendents or turfgrass managers who actually have used the MLSN guidelines, and we'll talk to them about how it's worked and some of the challenges that they've faced. I'm going to start by calling my friend Andrew McDaniel in Japan. He's the golf course superintendent at Keia Golf Club, and I've had a chance to visit there and see the turf conditions at Keia Golf Club for a number of years, and let's see what Andrew has to say. Good morning, Andrew. How are you doing?
Great. Good morning, Micah.
And where are you at this morning?
I'm on number 12 at Keia Golf Club in Fukuoka, Japan.
All right. And you've got warm season grass there. Is that correct?
That's correct. We've got Zoysia matrella on the tees, fairways, and greens, and Zoysia japonica in the roughs.
Is that a busy golf course?
Yeah, I would say we're quite busy. We get about 45,000 rounds a year. We're open about, I'd say, 350 days out of the year. So yeah, we're quite busy, especially in the fall, moving into the winter time when the grass isn't really growing very much.
How many groups of golfers will be out there today?
Today we are scheduled for 51 groups, which would be about 200 golfers.
Wow, that's busy. Well, thank you for taking the time to chat with me.
You're very welcome.
Now, you've been using MLSN at this facility for 6 years.
Yes.
And how has that worked out for you?
That's worked great so far. We have no problems whatsoever as far as any deficiencies that we've seen visually. So far so good. And you've got a professional tournament there at the end of August, which I know you do a lot of rolling and mowing the grass very short, putting a lot of traffic stress onto it at the very hot season of the year. Do you ever worry that MLSN isn't providing enough nutrients to deal with that? I've never worried about the MLSN issue. I've just worried about just taking the grass a little bit too far with daily rolling and double cutting every day, even triple cutting during the tournament week. But no issues through the tournament either. It's held up
fine. Actually, gets better and better the more we put the mowers on it.
Awesome. Well, that's very good. Is there anything else about MLSN? I know you prior to this job, you'd worked with some bent grass in Japan and were applying a very similar approach.
Yeah, I used to work in the Kansai and Kanto area where a lot of bent grass courses we worked with, and I wouldn't say we were using MLSN, but we were doing very simple, using urea, ammonium sulfate, not even putting any calcium or those amino acids or whatnot. Very simple fertilizing practices, and yeah, the bent grass held up fine as well in those areas, and that's a tough place to grow grass as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
You're welcome.
And goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
The next person I called was Sue Crawford. She has shared some really interesting photos of extremely healthy grass with roots that just continue to develop and grow deeper and deeper after implementing MLSN. So let's hear what Sue has to say.
Hello, Sue. How are you today?
I'm well, Micah. How are you?
I'm doing great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Yeah, of course.
So you're the course operations manager at Brightwood Golf and Country Club. Where is that located?
That's in Nova Scotia, Canada, on the very far east coast of the country.
And what grass types are you growing there, and how long is the season? What kind of traffic do you get?
Yeah, we're Donald Ross coordinator, predominantly POA on the greens. And tees have been redone to bent grass and POA supina, and the fairways are a mix of pretty well everything going.
Okay, and so the season goes from when to when?
Oh, sorry, yeah. That goes from April until middle of November. And we get about between 25,000 and 30,000 rounds a year.
Oh, wow. That's so when you're open, you're pretty busy.
Yeah, we're packed from about 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 or 7 o'clock at night. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I have to ask you, you're on the other side of the world from me. I'm in Thailand right now. How and when did you even find out about this MLSN approach to soil test interpretation and fertilizer recommendations?
Well, I joined Twitter about probably 2 or 3 years ago, and I came across a lot of superintendents talking about it. So once I Googled what MLSN was and read about it on the internet and went from there. It made perfect sense to me, so I decided to try it.
Okay, and as you started trying it, did you have any challenges that came up or difficulties?
Yeah, probably the biggest challenge was the mental hurdle that I had to get over. You know, we've always applied complete fertilizers and calcium sort of on a regular basis. It didn't really, the soil reports, no one ever said if they were good, then you just needed to apply straight nitrogen or straight potassium. So kind of wrapping your head around that, it's kind of like taking a leap of faith into that your guidelines are going to work. And I know that they're based on testing from reports of thousands of golf courses around the world. So it made sense. So I guess you've got to try it to believe it, I suppose.
So you started trying it 2 years ago, 3?
Yeah, probably 3 years ago, we took 3 greens and tested it on 3 of them, just as a trial, kind of tiptoed my way into it. And then the next year, spread to the greens, and then last year, wall-to-wall. So fairways, tees, and greens.
And since you've done that wall-to-wall, have you noticed any decline, improvement, same conditions?
Yeah, the grass is growing. It's growing well. The roots are better. I find that they're more consistent throughout the year. They're coming out the bottom of the cup cutter at this point. Right from April until even now, they're still all summer and all season. They've been really good. We're putting out less water, irrigation water. Grass seems to be mining it from the soil better. We've also reduced our fertilizer budget by about $10,000 Greens we've reduced it about 60%, and teas and we're around 65 to 70% cost reduction. So yeah, it's been great. I really have no complaints other than just kind of wrapping your head and believing that it's going to work. Then after the first year, it was great. Yeah, no looking back at this point. Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to hear about such a success with that in different areas, both with the cost and with the turf quality. So, well, thank you very much for taking the time to share that with me. And I look forward to meeting you again sometime in hopefully the not too distant future.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks for inviting me onto the call. Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Right, bye.
I made one more call to Bjarni Hannesson in Iceland. He's worked as a golf course manager and also done work with football pitches, and I was interested to hear what he had to say about his years of experience using the MLSN guidelines.
Hello, Bjarni. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me. How are you today?
I am very fine, thank you. Here in Iceland, the weather could be better, but that's 365 days of the year that way, so we're fine.
What's the temperature now?
It's been weird. It was below freezing 2 days ago. It's close to 10 degrees today, and it's supposed to dip down again. So it's up and down. It's everywhere, pretty much.
All right. Well, when I first met you, you were the course manager at Keilir Golf Club near Reykjavik, and I understand this year you started a new role. What is that?
Well, I decided to move into consulting, so I've been working with golf courses and football pitches here in Iceland just as a full-time consultant on my own, and it's been going great this year. But I've been working with now quite a few golf clubs with MLSN and football pitches as well. So that's what I'm doing right now.
Excellent. And I have to ask you. I think you've been doing MLSN for 5 or 6 years now, something like that. But yep. How did you even find out about MLSN? We're pretty far apart in the world.
Yeah, we are. I had I had a conversation with Agnar Kvalbein, who is a Norwegian scientist. And he was pointing out things that I have been figuring out sort of gradually through my greenkeeping career, is that he was pointing out articles that showed that potassium didn't do anything and didn't help us. And I was like, in large quantities. And I was like, yeah, it makes sense. And started looking for articles online. And that's around 2012. So I'm assuming that's around the time the MLSN sort of starts coming out online, right? So that's where I found it. And it was sort of the first time I saw something that made sense to what I was seeing in the field. And that's why I guess it was just a timing thing. I think if I didn't have that conversation with Agnar at the time, I might have found out a little bit later. It just happened to sort of around about the time you start putting these things out. I was Googling and I was looking for information. So that's the way I found it. All the way up here in Iceland. Google works here in Iceland too. It's amazing. It's
well, excellent. So after you started doing MLSN, what did you see with the grass condition? Was the grass the same, better, worse? Notice anything?
No, it wasn't. No, it was the same. I would say the same. I just I wouldn't say I've seen massive changes. I've been able to produce good grass. It just helped me sort of controlling the grass growth, which is not necessarily related to the MLSN, but sort of it just made me aware that I could get away with just using nitrogen in my case, because they were quite high on phosphorus and potassium and other things, and I was comfortable about it, and we didn't see any decline of any sort. Greens performed great. The major difference I've seen maybe is that bent grasses, that's brown top bents or colonial bent, depending on where in the world you are, but they seem to be doing quite well. But we didn't see there's no detrimental effect of any sort, just good grass. And that's on football pitches as well, because we maintain football pitches, which is rye and Poa patensis. That's what we're trying to grow. Obviously a lot of Poa annua too. And on our greens, we were trying to go fescues and bents, but obviously a lot of Poa too. So seem to work fantastic with both greens, both football and golf.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned the temperature extremes and variations that you've seen recently, and I know, when I think of Iceland, I think it's a pretty extreme climate. The winters can be long and harsh, and then in the summer, you really have if you have a summer, it's going to be a short growing season when you really need the grass to perform for you. So are you worried at all that MLSN is somehow not providing the nutrients that you need for the turf in such a stressful growing environment?
No, we've deliberately on few areas which we have identified not necessarily being important until this year. We tried it on 2 putting greens, which were showing very low numbers for phosphorus in this case, for example. We've been able to drop the phosphorus levels very low, and we're talking about in the sort of 14 parts per million, which is under your MLSN limits. And we're not seeing any detrimental effect. And we got to remember, we are not on a volcanic island, and we are working with volcanic soils. So, and they tend to, according to the agricultural world here in Iceland, the agricultural scientists tend to lock up P in large quantities, and we've been able to run them very low, and they're performing great. So we've been very happy. We don't see any detrimental effect, even though we're going, like you say, through very long and tough winters with a lot of freeze-thaw cycles left, right, and then flushing events where we have a lot of snow melt taking place. Nothing, we haven't had any issues with them.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that information. That answers some very interesting questions about that part of the world and the use of MLSN. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again, and goodbye.
See you in Iceland soon with ice cream, I guess.
Thank you.
So there we have it. I've explained how MLSN can answer the 2 important questions about soil test interpretation, ensuring that we supply every nutrient that the grass requires and being able to supply those nutrients in just the right amounts. And this method gets away from the humbug of some of the conventional guidelines, some of the methods of interpreting soil tests that invariably result in fertilizer recommendations that don't do anything for the grass. We also heard from some people who've used MLSN and helped to develop MLSN. Andrew McDaniel said that it worked great and he's had no problems whatsoever. Sue Crawford noted that the roots are better, she's using less water, and she also reduced the fertilizer budget by about 60%. And she said it's been great. When I talked with Larry Stowell, he said that MLSN is ideal for using as a solid method to make fertilizer recommendations, especially if you're looking to be reducing inputs and having the smallest environmental footprint. When I spoke with Bjarni, he said this method really makes sense to what he's seeing in the field. It helps with controlling growth. The greens are performing great. He noted that it worked fantastic for both golf and for football pitches, and he said that there were no detrimental effects of any sort. So that's it. There's plenty more information available in the description to this video, and also, as always, at my website, www.asianturfgrass.com. Thank you.